Hello, everyone. Please go ahead and put your name and your campus in the chat, please. We just want to know where y'all are from. And then also, I know that some of you are receiving credit, particularly if it's professional development credit. So we just want to make sure which campus you're from. So welcome everyone. Such a great opportunity to see everybody today. I know we're getting closer and closer for some folks to midterms and then obviously spring break for others. So we just want to say thank you for being here. I'm Patty Robinson, Faculty Director of Civic and Community Engagement at College of the Canyons. And I am joined by our wonderful set of co-hosts. We've got Kimberly Rosenfeld and Jan Connell, both of whom are from Cerritos. And then we also are joined today with Rebecca Moonstone, and where she moved, her square moved on me. Oh, there she is, Kaylin Koning, also from 3CSN. So again, we are just so pleased to have all of them here today with this great presentation that we're about to hear. So I know that some of you have joined us before and you're very familiar with our Civic Dialogue series. And then in other cases, this is the first time some of you are joining. So just to give you a little bit of the history, we began the Civic Dialogue series in fall 2020 as part of an intersegmental partnership addressing how to create a civic engagement pathway between the California Community College system and the California State University system. This work started out as a Bringing Theory to Practice grant, or part of a Bringing Theory to Practice grant, as continued as a second Bringing Theory to Practice grant, also involving numerous colleges and universities, including COC, Cerritos, LA City, also Cal State Dominguez Hills, Cal State Northridge, and also Cal State Los Angeles. Why we created this series is that we wanted to really try and bring greater understanding of civic learning and democratic engagement to a larger audience, particularly within the community college system. We thought one of the best ways to do this certainly was to create a virtual series that will allow us to bring in some of the nation's leading scholars, researchers, and practitioners, and that's what we've done. We thought it would last a semester. We are now, I think, into our fourth semester, so it is going strong. Our presentations are recorded and they are available on the 3CSN website. Today's presentation is set up in two parts. The first part will be our speaker, Scott Warren, who's going to be addressing you for our first hour. And then the second hour will be a deeper dive for those of you who want to continue, where Kimberly, Jan, and I will facilitate another discussion. We have three guiding frameworks of our series to advance understanding of the intersection between equity, agency, and civic engagement, also to recognize civic community and democratic engagement as a high impact practice and connected to guide pathways, and also to leverage participants in particularly your knowledge with regarding how to build capacity to innovate for local and global change. And with that, I want to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Scott Warren. Scott is an amazing young man, and I emphasize young because I know he's older than he looks, but I had the pleasure of meeting Scott about a year and a half ago, and he's just a phenomenal young guy. Scott is the founder and former chief executive officer of Generation Citizen. He co-founded the organization at Brown University with fellow student Anna Neenan during their senior year working with students in the local Providence community. From that starting point in 2008, Scott has grown Generation Citizen and was able to keep growing it to become one of the preeminent civic education organizations in the country, promoting action civics across diverse geographies through best in-class programming and concrete policy change. Scott has served as a social entrepreneur in residence at Brown University and Tufts University, and has published a book in 2019 entitled Generation Citizen, The Power of Youth in Politics. Scott was named an Echoing Green Fellow in 2010 and a Draper Richards Kaplan Fellow in 2012. He continues to write on subjects ranging from youth political engagement to African politics to sports, and has been published and featured in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Christian Science Monitor, Education Week, the New York Daily News, Huffington Post, San Diego Union Tribune, Sports Illustrated, Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Providence Journal. And so with that, it's with great pleasure we welcome Scott Warren here today.
Thanks so much, Patty, and thanks so much, all of you. It is great to be with you all, albeit virtually. I'm coming to you from San Diego, which is my hometown, and I've been doing some teaching at UCSD as well. So it's great to be with you all. I'm gonna do a little bit of a presentation talking about my background and some of the themes that Patty mentioned in terms of democratic and political engagement. I'd love to, to the extent possible, make this interactive. I know, sometimes that's easier said than done in the virtual space. But if you do have questions, thoughts while I'm presenting, please feel free to put them in the chat, and then I will leave some time for Q&A as well. But please feel free to drop them at any point. And yeah, just excited to be here with you all, and think this series is so fantastic in so many different ways. And so what I'm hopeful is that I'll leave you with some things to think about more than anything else. But I am going to share screen. This is always the precarious part of getting going, but can you all see? All right, good. And then let us do the slideshow. Okay. So I'm going to talk about youth political engagement. I got a number of hats I'm wearing here today. And so here, it just froze on me for a second. But still affiliated with Johns Hopkins, the SNF Agora Institute. I'm teaching at UCSD, and I actually have started doing some work with USAID, the United States Agency for International Development, on youth political engagement. So youth political engagement is my passion. It's what I do. And I want to talk a little bit about why I care about it. This specific moment in time, which I think is really important to think about in a moment in which there's so much challenging occurring in the way of democracy around the world. There's democratic erosion occurring. We see this in the crisis of Ukraine that really has pitted democracy against authoritarianism and autocracy in a very real sense. And the sort of so what does that mean for young people is something that I think is important to talk through. I'm going to start with a little bit of a definition of democracy. I think sometimes we talk about democracy being at risk and we don't actually talk about what democracy means. So this is, I sort of like starting with this idealistic terminology. Democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. It's our 16th president, Abe Lincoln. It's like all that democracy can be. And then this is from philosopher H.L. Mencken. Democracy is only a dream. It should be put in the same category as Arcadia, Santa Claus, and heaven. So I'd be curious which one you all think is closer to reality. Is closer to reality, whether it's Abe Lincoln or H.L. Mencken's version of it. This is sort of the definition that is a little bit more the one that I'll use and a little bit more sort of literally. And so democracy really does mean government by the people. So specifically when the supreme power is vested in the people and exercised by them directly or indirectly through a system of representation. And so that's what we mean by democracy at its core, is people having the ability to make their voices heard in a system of government that listens to those voices. And so one thing that's interesting to think about is, can your educational institutions be democracies? Can your communities be democracies? I think it's something that we think more and more about is this notion of realizing that democracy is not something that's just a political institution, but something that can be part of our everyday lives on an everyday basis. And then democratic engagement, and Patty mentioned the term earlier, but the way that I conceive of it is knowledge, skills, behaviors, and values that we use to collectively solve public challenges. And I think this is important because sometimes politics gets, sort of reduced down to voting, which is very important, but is not everything. Or, it gets sort of just, pushed in a very specific way. And I think democratic engagement is important to the extent that it's broader than that. It includes how we engage with people on an everyday basis. It involves how we actually work together with people to solve problems. And so that's a definition that I would posit is worth us thinking about. And then to think about what it means to be a citizen, and this led me to some of my work. I think the notion of citizen sometimes comes across as like almost like a political definition in terms of what it actually means to be a legal citizen. But I think being a citizen is a right, a responsibility, and a cultural ideal. So literally, it's a right. Some of these are bestowed to us in the Constitution, but that we can vote, that we can run for elected office, that we can pursue life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It's also a responsibility, and I think that this is something that we might not necessarily think about as much. But what is our responsibility as citizens participating in our local community, not just voting, but the responsibility to actually participate in the democratic process too. But I think more importantly than all of that, it is a cultural ideal. And this is something that I sometimes think that we've lost track of a little bit in the United States and around the world. That being a citizen is something that has principles, it has values, it has expectations. I don't necessarily know if we agree on what those principles, values, and expectations are. And a lot of the political arguments that I think we find ourselves in the moment is sort of a lack of synergy in terms of what we actually mean by the notion of cultural ideal of citizenship. And so that's just something to think about as well. Wanted to talk a little bit, so sort of like setting the stage on democracy and citizen engagement, about my own journey to caring about democracy, my own civic journey, and I think that that's something for us all to to think about, and I'd be curious to hear yours. But as I said, I'm from San Diego, but my dad joined the State Department, the Foreign Service, when I was 8 years old. And so I spent the majority of my childhood living abroad in Latin America and East Africa. And the picture on the screen I actually took with my digital camera back in 2002. So contrary to, I feel old to Patty's remarks, but I was in 8th grade in 2002, and this is did it stop share? Can you all see me?
I apologize. I will fix that right now. Sorry.
No worries. It looks like I can keep talking, but it looks like I can't share screen right now. So the picture that I'll put up in a second again is I had the opportunity to observe the first truly democratic elections in Kenya's history. Here we go. And so this is a schoolroom, or the back of a schoolhouse at 6 a.m. in a rural town called Rongai. And throughout the day, I just saw so many scenes like this where you had a diverse array of individuals that were so excited to cast their vote, to actually make a difference in the trajectory of their country. And it was really inspiring for me to see the power of what democracy can actually be. And Kenyans actually in this 2002 election elected the opposition candidate, which in emerging democracies is pretty rare. And the challenge with this, and so it was there were all these folks that thought that democracy had really made a difference in the trajectory of their country. And then 5 years later, there was another election that occurred, and it did not go as well. There was violence in the streets, and over 1,000 people died, and the same opposition leader that had won rigged the election and maintained control of the country. And so I think for me, that really showed the power of democracy when it works, but the fragility of it, of something that needs to be molded and cultivated and improved upon over time. And then this is sort of the next stage of my journey, but I started college at Brown in 2005, and I'd been very focused on international issues. And during my orientation, and for those of you in college orientation, you're getting to know people, really exciting time. Hurricane Katrina was bearing down on New Orleans and Louisiana. And I remember, starting to see pictures and news coverage, and our president of Brown at the time had gone to school at Dillard in New Orleans. And it was a shock factor for me. It was just shocking to see that the United States was not taking care of its own. That you see the entire 9th Ward underwater, and it took years for us to rebuild it, and it was predominantly in low income and historically disenfranchised settings. And so this was something where I started to realize, okay, what's my obligation to the US as someone that had been very internationally focused. And so something just to think about that I'm curious for folks is, thinking about where you feel that community is. But for me, there was this, I had been very internationally focused and thinking about Katrina as well, which is something that was very, very moving and powerful for me. But then in college, I was actually very active on atrocities, on what we declared to be a genocide ongoing in Darfur, Sudan. And I show these pictures as these are the different ways to become democratically engaged. And so, one is, and this is when I was much younger, but is on the steps of the Student Center at Brown, and we convinced the Brown University to divest its assets from companies doing business in Sudan, because they were abetting the genocide in Darfur, and so we were able to successfully do that. And then there's an image we did so on the state of Rhode Island too, and Rhode Island became one of the first states in the country to divest from Sudan. And then also I engaged in civil disobedience and was arrested in front of the White House trying to get then President Bush to do more on Sudan. And so this was really my arc in terms of realizing the importance of young people taking action. That's been front and center, but all the different ways that you can take action too. So with all this said, one of the things I started to realize, and I'm curious how this resonates with you all, especially the students, is that I was taking all this action and I was getting involved locally and politically, but I was realizing that a lot of my peers weren't really interested in getting involved in the political process. They wanted to make a difference in their communities, but didn't necessarily see politics as the best way to do so. And there are a whole host of reasons for this, but one is that young people really they don't trust government in the way that we used to, and so and I think a lot of that is deservedly so. So this is a chart that shows public trust in government, starting in the 60s when it was very high, as high as almost 80%, and then through Watergate and through wars. And through the financial crisis, it started decreasing to a point where it's below 20%. And this is specifically I think relevant as it pertains to young people. And young people, I think, are very frustrated, and again, want to hear from you all, but very frustrated to the extent that they've been told to believe in a process that they feel like has fundamentally, not worked for them, and not provided them with, economic stability, not provided them with, not provided action on climate change. And so, you can see the scale in terms of how many people think it's essential to live in a democracy. 72% of Americans born before World War II say 10, and millennials, less than 33% check the same. So less than 33% of millennials think it's important to live in democracy. Only 32% of millennials, and I know young people now are Gen Z, and I'm curious how this pertains, but only 32% of millennials believe they have a legitimate voice in the political process. And this, I think, is really interesting and gets to the work that I've been doing. But this is a global index, the Youth Development Index, and over the last 10 years, young people around the world, this is around the world, are actually doing a lot better as it comes to health and well-being and peace and security and education and equity and inclusion, but not in political and civic participation. We are not investing in youth political and civic participation. A lot of this, even though it's global, a lot of this had to do with the US and other Western areas too. So what does that mean? So I recognizing, as I said before, that I believe deeply in the power of politics and the power of democracy, but recognize too that a lot of my peers didn't necessarily feel the same way. Whole host of reasons for that, but one is that we don't really teach civics education anymore, and when we do, it's sort of seen as here are the branches of government, here's how a bill becomes a law, sort of one of the most boring classes in school. When we do, we don't teach it equitably. Students from more affluent backgrounds tend to get a more established civics education than those who are not. And so my senior year at Brown, so same age as probably a lot of you, I helped start an organization called Generation Citizen, which is really working to transform civics education. So to get it back in the classroom and make it action oriented and relevant. And to make civics as exciting and vibrant as any other subject in school, to make it as vibrant as how excited the Kenyans I saw in Rongai were to participate in the process. And so how we actually do that is that we support classroom teachers to teach what we call an action civics course, where young people learn politics through actually doing politics. And so what does that actually look like? We have something that we call an advocacy hourglass. And so it's purposefully starts broad and then gets narrow and gets broad again, where young people, we ask them, what would you change if you were in charge of your city, your school, your state, your country? And they talk about a whole range of issues. They'll talk about climate change. They'll talk about police brutality. They'll talk about homelessness. And then they get a level deeper. So what's one specific thing that we want to do? It might be a fossil fuel plant in a local community. It might be establishing a public commission to actually look at public safety. And then get to the root cause. So why is this problem exist? Maybe it's a lack of trust between the public and the police. Maybe it's a bill that's not in place. And then from there, figuring out a specific goal to actually address that root cause, figuring out targets. So who are the people that can actually make the decisions that will allow us to move forward? And then tactics. So what can we actually do to achieve our goal? And so that could be everything, sort of what I was showing before, everything from getting in contact with decision makers, to holding rallies, to engaging in social media and digital activism. So this is how we actually, our students actually go through the process. I wanted to show this too, because I think that this is something we think a lot about Generation Citizen. It's what kinds of citizens are we trying to actually help develop? And so this goes back to the earlier slide on citizenship as a cultural ideal. Sort of this great article that came out a few decades ago called "What Kind of Citizen?" And this is not meant to be values laden, but there's sort of three main types of citizens they go over. So one is personally responsible. So there's not enough food in a community, so I'm personally responsible. I'm going to donate to a food bank. That's really important. There needs to be more food. Another level, participatory. I'm actually going to organize a food drive. I'm going to get my neighbors and community members and fellow students and colleagues involved. And the third is justice oriented. So I'm going to actually ask why people are hungry. What are the resources that are not coming to bear? Why in community as wealthy as ours are people still going hungry? And that's how I'm going to take action. And sort of need all three of these. You need people doing all of these different types of action. But I do think it's really important to think about that justice oriented framework in terms of actually asking why problems exist and trying to take action in some sort of way. And the way that we think about, how we actually measure these, and this goes to the democratic engagement work that I talked about before, is actually thinking about civic knowledge. So how much do students know about the political process? Civic skills. So what are the specific skills like oral and written persuasive communication, group work, critical thinking, that are part of, being an engaged citizen? And then civic motivation, values, dispositions. Are young people, do they want to make a difference? To the earlier slides, do they believe that democracy can actually work? And what are the values they hold? Do they actually value pluralism and engaging in the community as well? So that's what Generation Citizen does. I sort of, before I go into the next, part and sort of close out here, as Patty said, I stepped down from the CEO role a little bit more than a year ago. And so I'm still on the board and still very supportive of the organization. But one of the things that I've just become very interested in and motivated by is just the crisis that we find ourselves in democracy, both here and around the world. And there's all sorts of trends and all sorts of data points that demonstrate that we're in a democratic recession around the world, that there's more autocracies and authoritarian governments that are coming into power, that people don't have voice. A lot of this got worse during COVID, where governments closed civic spaces. And so there's this burning question of are we losing faith in democracy? And if so, what does that mean? And again, I think you're very much seeing that play out in Ukraine right now, where is this battle between an authoritarian country that's coming in and trying to take the rights and sovereignty from a people, And what does it mean to actually fight for democracy? Why is it so important for us to actually live in a democracy itself? And so that's something that I'd be curious to get from you. But so my work has increasingly become on sort of the notion of democracy and actually engaging more of an international component too. I think that the U.S. faces so many challenges, but we have a lot to learn from how other young people and organizations are tackling the democratic crisis around the world, and the fact that these challenges are so global in scope shows that there's things that are going much deeper than are just happening in the U.S. too. So those are all things to be thinking about that I'm focusing on as well. So this notion of, is it worse than ever? One stat, based in voter turnout, and this got a little bit better in the 2020 election, but the U.S. ranked 31st out of 35 OECD. So these are the most economically prosperous countries in the world in terms of voter turnout. From 2012 to 2016, young people are voting more. They voted more in 2016 and 2020, but not necessarily in midterms. And so we do have midterms coming up in just a few months. And so I think it's really important that young people engage there. We have polarization that's worse than it's ever been. And so we demonize people that are from different political parties. I thought that this one was particularly interesting, and I think these have gotten worse. I was trying to look for recent polls on this, but in 1960, there was a poll from Pew that, would you be upset if you had a kid that married someone from a different party? So if you're a Republican, would you be upset if they married a Democrat, and vice versa? And only 5% and 4%, it wasn't a big deal. It became 49% for Republicans in 2010 and 33% for Democrats, and I'm sure that's much higher. We just don't want to engage with people who are not like us. I think that this is interesting too. These trust angles continue to get bad. At the bottom of, you'll see that in 1973, 60% of young people trusted government to do the right thing. Only 20% feel like the federal government can be trusted now. And this relates to crises too. So even in the Great Depression was the worst economic conditions in generations, 50% of people thought that economic conditions would eventually improve. During the Reagan era recession, the 80s, 41% that thought that economic conditions would improve. But in 2010, after the financial crisis, only 35% expected better. And after COVID, it's been quite low too. I think that one of the things I want to end on is this notion of, like, why does democracy actually matter? Why does it matter that we participate? Why does it matter that we're teaching young people how to actually participate? And why does it matter that the U.S. has one of the lowest voting rates in the world? I've started doing some research in terms of showing that that the more that people actually participate, the better economic outcomes that they face that countries have for wide swaths of the population. So countries that have lower levels of voter turnout are more likely to have bigger gaps in responsiveness between the rich and the poor. So what this means basically, and we see this in the US, is that we have this problem where the more money you have, the more likely it is that you are to vote. And when that happens, then elected officials are more likely to pay attention to people that vote who tend to have more money. And so the cycle repeats itself. And so one of the things that we're trying to do is, how do we make sure that that more people are participating and really creating that culture of political engagement. And so that's something that I think is really important, not just for sort of this opaque notion of citizen participation, but for actual outcomes too. So if participation matters, and why are people turning away? And this goes to a central thesis and something I'd love to hear from you all at. But young people are coming of age in just an incredibly tumultuous period. There's it's impossible for our elected officials to make progress on anything. So there's political paralysis, there's declining civility and dialogue, and there's a lot of anxiety about economic security. Are we going to be all right? And so young people specifically are fed up. I think you're also seeing frustration with the lack of action on climate change. And so this sort of the breaking the cycle is what I'm really interested in trying to figure out. It's really hard to do. So on one side of the spectrum, you have young people that do really want to make a difference. They do really want to figure out how we change the fundamentals and systems that have created so much inequality and inequity for so long. On the other side, you have democracy that's not working and needs people to actually participate. But young people don't want to participate in a system that they feel like is not working. So what happens? What happens when, is the solution to, participate and make it better? Is it to fundamentally reimagine what the system looks like? Is it to break it all down? And I'm finding that young people are, participating in different ways. So beyond just voting, engaging in social media, engaging in creative types of engagement, looking at participation beyond just politics, and looking at participatory budgeting, where they're actually participating and making decisions on how budgets are allocated. So I'd love to hear from you all on this, but I think this is almost the crux of what I'm realizing is I still fundamentally believe, at my core, that democracy works and that it matters. I also understand why young people are so frustrated. And I think we need to reconceive what it means to actually be a democratically engaged citizen. It needs to be more than just voting. And so we need young people to think creatively about what it means to participate. We need elected officials and governments and leaders to recognize why young people are frustrated and to meet them where they're at too. And so these are just, some general questions that we can go through on here, but, I'm curious if folks believe in democracy, how people are participating, how they can take effective action, and what community means to you right now. But at the core, I will say, to finish off, I fundamentally believe that, for us to get to a better democracy, a more equitable democracy, a more just society, it is going to take youth action. That will be, what takes us, from where we are now to a more prosperous reality. And because that's what's always happened throughout our history. That's what my book was about, is looking at all the times throughout history in the US and around the world, where young people, due to their idealism, due to their refusing to accept the status quo, continue to move things forward. And so, encourage all of you to stay active as well. So I will stop sharing now, and would love any thoughts, questions, thoughts from you all about what you think about democratic participation and political engagement. But would love to hear from all of you.